Tommaso Pardi. I'm the director of Gerpisa. This is my presentation for the 2022 Gerpisa International Colloquium. I'm going to talk today about the diffusion of lean production in the automotive industry, and my presentation is based on a chapter that I've written for the Cambridge International Handbook of Lean Production, edited by Thomas Janowski and Darina Lepadato and published by Cambridge University Press last year, 2021. So the story of the diffusion of lean production in the automotive industry is a very well-known one, and one that is very much shaped by the lean narratives. This narrative goes more or less in the following way. The 1970-98 crisis has been framed as a crisis of the mass production system used by US and European car manufacturers. This mass production system was characterized by a production that was pushed by economy of scale, focusing on volumes, and that was the cause of overproduction. Also, because of the focus on volume and scale, most of these products were very much standardized, and therefore these car makers were not capable of producing the variety and degree of customization of product that was now required by the market. Also, the focus on scale made the process very inefficient because there were huge stocks of parts all around the factories that makes the whole process very inefficient, and also led to poor quality. Quality was only checked at the end of the line, and that involved a lot of repair that also cost a lot of money, but in the end, products were of a bad quality. And on the top of all these problems, mass production had conflicts with the suppliers, but in particular conflict between employers and workers, because workers did not want to work anymore in these factories. Jobs was repetitive, physically demanding, and not interesting. By contrast, the Japanese car manufacturers that were taking substantial shares of the market from US car makers and European car makers were characterized by a very different productive model that start to be described as a post-Fordist productive model, a productive model where production is not pushed by economy of scales, but is pulled by the market, organized in small batches, allowing for flexibility and for more variety. Zero stocks as the production is pulled, and that was also allowing for a constant optimization of the production flow, keeping quality under check at each step of the production, which is also called total quality management, and involving also better working conditions, because workers are here part of the constant optimization of the production flow. They contribute with their suggestion, and this makes their jobs more interesting, more autonomous, more satisfactory. Now, the question that these way of describing in black and white mass production and Japanese model of production put forward was whether this was just a Japanese model or universal model, because Japan was characterized by very specific culture, labor institutions, corporate structure. So was this model, was possible to transfer this model outside Japan in the US, for example? Right? Here is where the MVP, the International Motor Vehicle Program's second phase between 1985 and 1990, played a crucial role in closing the debate to a certain extent by using benchmarking more or less 100 factories around the world. There were Japanese factories, US factories, European factories, and the MVP team found out that Japanese factories were much more productive, used less hours of work, used less space, used less stock and parts, and produced better quality products. And the Japanese transplants that Japanese companies have created in North America were as much as competitive as their sister factories in Japan, and much more efficient than North American factories. And they were achieving these performances with American workers, sometimes with trade unions. So the answer was, this is universal. And the question that remained was whether the American and European car makers would converge fast enough to lean production to survive the challenge of Japanese competition. And so if we move forward to the present, one would say that actually lean production diffused through all the industry inside the supply chain, through the suppliers in Western countries and emerging countries, and has become now the dominant paradigm, demonstrating therefore that the lean production narrative was right on all the points. Now, interesting, this question of convergence or that was the starting point of the first international program of Gerpisa in 1992. And since then, Gerpisa has produced a series of works that has questioned this narrative. And I would highlight here three main paradoxes that have been identified in this literature. So the first paradox is that since lean production is a post-Fordist model of production, is expected to not generate any more Fordist crises. Fordist crises were associated with overcapacity and overproduction. Now, since production is pulled by the market, car makers are expected to not overproduce anymore. So this, for example, was the thesis of the famous book Beyond Mass Production of Ken in Florida of 1993, when they say, with the diffusion of lean, cyclical economic crises will just disappear. Now, this has not been the case. Lean has diffused in the automotive industry, lean has diffused in the economy, and we've seen cyclical economic crises coming back over and over again with the same consequences as the Fordist crisis. That was the Japanese crisis in the 90s, the Asian crisis in 1996, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and each time we've seen overproduction, factory closures, redundancies, states stepping in to rescue companies from bankruptcy, mergers between weak companies to survive. So the industry has kept falling into Fordist crisis despite having adopted the post-Fordist model of production. That is the first paradox. The second paradox is that one of the key elements of the lean production thesis was that leaner car makers were more competitive than less lean or non-lean car manufacturer. And that was precisely what the benchmark of the 1980s showed. Japanese car makers are winning because they have more efficient factories. Now, in the 1990s and 2000s, this was not true anymore. And the case that I know better is Europe. Europe was described by the machine that changed the world are the place where car makers were the worst. They were the worst in manufacturing. And the only reason why they survived the 1980s was because they were protected. The market share of Japanese car makers were frozen in Europe. But since the Japanese car makers had created transplants in the UK and then later in France, Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, and since with the single market, these protectionist measures were going to disappear, the author of the Machine That Changed the World book said European car makers will be wiped out and few of them will survive by the end of the decade. Now, this has not happened at all. Actually, the opposite has happened. Japanese firms have invested massively in Europe, over 10 billion euros since the 1990s, to create a very significant capacity and have systematically failed to increase the market share and make profits. Honda is now closing its factory in the UK, and Nissan has been completely reorganized by Renault when it was at the brink of bankruptcy. The car makers that have dominated the European market were companies that were systematically at the bottom of this benchmark in terms of lean production capacity. Peugeot, Renault in the 90s, Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler in the 2000, 2010. And also, if you look at China, the leader of the market are not at all the most lean manufacturer, a company like GM and Volkswagen, which are well known for being bad at manufacturing. This was highlighted by several books, and I would say that even the last book made by the MVP, the 2004, the Second Century book by Matthias Solveig and Fritz Pill, well, they say that they show that they had this data collected in 1994 and 2000 on factories that kept showing that Japanese car makers had a huge advantage, but these advantages will not translate anymore in market share and profits. Actually, Nissan, that was one of the most efficient car manufacturer in terms of lean organization, according to this data, was going bankrupt. And the company that was rescuing Nissan was Renault that was at the bottom of this benchmark. So clearly the correlation between the fact of being lean and the fact of being efficient in terms of profits and market share was not there anymore after the 1980s. The final paradox is that the diffusion of lean was expected to improve employment and working conditions, and this has not been the case at all. We have a very large evidence of case studies and statistical data that show that there is a clear correlation between the diffusion of lean and the fact that working conditions become worse. You work more, there's more overtime, you work worse, there's more intensity, you are stressed, you have physical problems, you have more chances of having professional disease, of a psychological breakdown if you're working in a lean organization. And we have statistical and fieldwork-based data that clearly show that. And this does not only apply to Western countries, but if you look at India, the diffusion of lean is not making employment conditions better, it's actually increasing the degree of casualization of jobs in the automotive industry, as shown, for example, by the last book by Tom Barnes. So how do we explain these paradoxes, and how do we explain that despite these paradoxes, lean production kept diffusing in the automotive industry and became the dominant paradigm? Now, I will explain these paradoxes, the origin of these paradoxes, as a problem of translation. So what was translated? The template of lean production was the Toyota production system. The Toyota production system was already known and described quite in detail before the lean production concept was created to help diffusing the Toyota production system in the Western world, where at the time, Japanese model had a bad reputation. So lean production is described as a post-Fordist model, flexible, pulled by the demand, allowing better working conditions and so on. The Toyota production system, as it was well known before the concept of lean production was even created, was a different thing. It was described as a rather rigid and fragile system of production, pulled not by the demand of consumer, but by the assembly line. So still focusing on economy of scale very much, requiring more standardized rather than less standardized product, and really employing worse conditions for workers. So I will use literature that was published before the lean production concept to illustrate that. This is an article published in 1977 in the International Journal of Production Research by the engineering department of Toyota. And one of the authors, Fujio Cho, even became later on the CEO of Toyota. So let me read a few passages from this article. The second distinct feature is that Japanese concept of work, such as consciousness and attitude, differ from that held by the European and American workers. The Japanese traits include group consciousness, sense of equality, desire to improve, a diligence born from a long history of an homogeneous race, high degree of ability resulting from higher education brought by desire to improve, centering the daily living around work. Also, unlike European countries, Japan does not have the problem of foreign workers. Therefore, from the standpoint of labor environment, Japan is much better off than the European and American countries. In order to make full use of the Japanese advantages, it is important that the industry have their workers display their capabilities to the utmost. So, Toyota Engineering Department consider that the implication that lifelong, completely centered on work implication of their workers was key to the viability of their productive model. Why they thought so? Well, the reason is that, first of all, the thing that corresponds to the first recognition of putting forth all efforts to attain low-cost production is reduction of costs through elimination of waste. This involves making up a system that will truly eliminate waste by assuming that anything other than the minimum amount of equipment, materials, parts, and workers, working time included, which are absolutely essential to production, are merely surplus that only raise the cost. In the just-in-time production, processes and all shops are kept in the state where they have no surplus, so that if trouble is left unattended, the line will immediately stop running and will affect the entire plant. The necessity for improvement can be easily understood by anyone. So this is important. So you have a system in which the target is to make the production flow having just enough resources to produce what is planned. That is why it's rigid, you cannot produce more or less, and why it's fragile. Anything can disrupt this very lean production flow. So the improvement is not something that you do on a willing basis. Kaizen is not something that adds productivity, it's what is required by the system in order to make the daily, weekly, monthly production. And what happens if you don't? At a workers with insufficient capability of improvement, they cannot avoid overtime for a while. Workers here are the only source of flexibility, is their overtime, their over effort that compensate for the rigidity and the fragility of the production flow. So how did these translate in terms of employment, working condition, functioning in the Toyota production system? Now, there is a book which is very useful for that. It's one of the best books, in my opinion, on the Toyota production system and on the automotive industry in Japan, which is the Michael Kusumano 1985 book, The Japanese Automobile Industry. And the interesting thing is that Kusumano was hired by Ross to teach in the MIT and was actually the master degree director of John Kravchik, who was the engineer that came from NAMI and developed together with Womack Johnson Ross and John Paul McDuffie also the concept of lean production. He was actually the person who came up with the concept. Before calling it lean production, they were calling it fragile production. That was, in my opinion, a more correct way of calling the Toyota production system. So the MVP team was perfectly aware what the Toyota production system was. So that's the way in which Kusumano describes how Toyota was functioning. Between 1965 and 1983, Nissan operated at rates between 82 and 97%. Toyota was constantly over 100% using overtime, unscheduled extra shifts higher than standard line speed, and increases in actual capacity and output before readjusting capacity estimates to achieve this time. In addition, Japanese constantly work more hours than American, approximately 10% more per year between 1965 and 1983. So how these translated in terms, so how was this possible? And Kusumano insists very much in his book about the fact that Toyota and other car companies has taken control of the trade unions to put people working in this condition. Despite his obvious genius as a production manager, Ono, the creator of the Toyota production system, still considered his success in controlling the union to have been the most important advantage Toyota gained over its domestic and foreign competitors. In the conclusion of the book, Kusumano wrote, demands from Japanese auto works for a greater share of the tremendous wealth they produce or for less strenuous job routines probably would have resulted in companies with smaller advantages over American and European automakers in productivity and cost. So you can see that this way of describing the Toyota production system has really nothing to do with the way the lean production book described the Toyota production system. So let me conceptualize this. So what are the viability conditions of the Toyota production system as we understood it already in the 1980s? Now we use three concepts that are well known in the lean production literature and theory: Muda, Mura, Muri. Muda is waste. It's what is targeted by the Toyota production system. So you want to eliminate waste in order to get this lean flow of production, which is very rigid and fragile. Because of that, the worst enemy of the rigid and fragile flow of production is Mura, variability. You want to reduce variability to a maximum in order to avoid Muri, which is overburden. If you don't do that, then you risk to have overburden and the system collapse. So the price to reduce variability was also to drastically reduce variety. You need to have products that are very simple to manufacture, that are more standardized than products that you add in factories where you could accommodate much more variety because you didn't have this rigidity and this fragility. So when Kusumano and later on Dan Coffey actually checked for the variety of that was offered by car makers in the market, they found out that contrary to what has been said by lean production literature, actually the Japanese car makers were offering much less variety than Western car makers. We're not talking about 10 times less, but 1,000 times less variety than Western companies would deliver. So it wasn't true that Japanese car makers were successful because we're selling a larger variety of product or customized product. This was completely a post-Fordist myth that was added to the Toyota production system. Actually, lean requires less variety and more standardized products to be viable. So why did the MVP team describe it, Toyota production system, as a post-Fordist model of production when actually it wasn't? So there are two reasons that emerged in my inquiry when I did some research on that in the 2000s. Dan Ross, one of the authors of the book, clearly told me, we wanted a book that would not be an academic book, and we hired an agent to represent us and to find a good ghostwriter. We didn't necessarily want to have a bestseller. What we wanted was to have an impact on the industry, and particularly on CEOs and senior executives. And in order to have this impact, that was also what the industry that was sponsoring the project wanted from the book. We wanted to have a concept that could be sold to their managers, that could be sold to the trade unions and to the workers, while they added these magic features, making lean production a managerial fashion. Also, I think that dressing lean production in post-Fordist clothes was also part of this post-Fordist literature. Since the 1970 crisis was seen as a crisis of Fordism, everybody expected the Toyota production system to be a post-Fordist system of production, to be flexible, to allow for more variety. And so that's why lean production dressed the Toyota production system in post-Fordist clothes. Now, if we move back and we understand that what has diffused is not the magic lean production, but the Toyota production system, then the paradoxes are not anymore paradoxes. Of course, this system cannot prevent or avoid cyclical crisis. It's still prone to overproduction. It's still a mass production system. When markets require more variety, more flexibility, customization, in particular in the up market, in the up part of the market where German car makers are very strong, lean is more a handicap when you are very lean rather than an advantage. And of course, this is clearly a system that makes work more precarious because it's the only source of flexibility that you have, and more intense. So it is not a surprise that the diffusion of the Toyota production system has made employment and working conditions in the global auto industry worse and not better. Now, why, despite this paradox, lean production triumphs and keeps diffusing? In the chapter, I spent some time on that. Here will be very brief. I think that the key reason was that the lean concept came at the right moment, and when the industry was get financialized, and finance wanted two things from the automotive industry. They wanted externalization, focusing on the core in order to increase rapidly shareholder value, and wanted downsizing, reducing the workforce. And lean template was capable of providing both. And so there is a clear interconnection between the financialization and the diffusion of lean. And the second reason is globalization. With the start of globalization in the 90s and 2000s, car makers had to restructure their industry at home and structure a new industry abroad very quickly. And lean production provided a template to have very light and very standardized factories all around the world, interconnected by the same standards and benchmarks. So these two processes made lean the right template to reorganize automotive production globally. Now, in the conclusion, in the chapter, I argue that these three paradoxes are not going away. Actually, you will see more and more of this because products the variety of the products is increasing, the need for innovation in product design is increasing with electrification, greening, digitalization. You have more opportunity to create new product design. There is more competition in terms of coming up with new products. And these makes life harder for a lean production environment. Also, whatever the workers have the opportunity they have, and they have the power balance, which is favorable, they always say, we do not want to work in these factories. There is no workers in the auto industry that is happy about their working conditions. And so sooner or later, this is going to become a problem. So one of the questions that could be raised in the debate is whether Industry 4.0, the digital lean, is the solution. I don't think so. It's a matter of debate. And I think we are reaching the limits. We are stretching the limits of the lean production paradigm. So once again, I think the time has come to look for new productive models. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the debate.